Welcome to our Thursday's broadcast of the Gospel Truth. Today I'm continuing to talk about how you can be as full of God as you want to be. It is not God that determines that, it's you. There's things that you can do that will release the power of God in your life. There's things you can do that will diminish it. And most people aren't aware of this. They just think that it's God, that if you don't have joy in your life, you approach God like, oh God, pour out your joy in my life. I've actually had people come up to me before and say, would you just please pray that God would just pour His love out in my life? And they think that that's a great request. And I'll say, no, I won't pray that. And it shocks people. And they think, well, why not? And I said, because God has already poured out His love. It says in Romans chapter 5, verse 8, that God commended His love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And it says the love of God is shed abroad in our heart, Romans chapter 5. And God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son. God is releasing His love. You don't need to pray, oh God, pour out your love in my life. What you got to do is pray, oh God, help my receiver. It's not your transmitter that's the problem, it's my receiver. Help me to receive the love of God. Now see, if a person will come and say, now look, I know that the Word teaches that God loves me, but I'm not experiencing it. Could you help me to experience it? Well, yeah, I could pray with you about that. But see, most people just think it's up to God. If you don't feel the love of God, it must be because God doesn't love you. If you don't feel the joy of the Lord, then it's because you don't have joy. The truth is you've already got love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance in your born-again spirit, Galatians 5:22 and 23. The problem isn't with God transmitting those things. The problem is your receiver is having a hard time. You're tuned into the wrong station. So anyway, I could just continue to say a lot of things about that. I've got this book entitled Discover the Keys to Staying Full of God. It'll teach you how to do these things we're talking about. I've got a brief summary of that right here entitled 4 Keys to Staying Full of God. And then I've also got a little booklet, Believing is Seeing, and that's what I've been talking about this week. It says in Romans chapter 1, verse 21, that there's 4 things you have to do to diminish or to turn off your receiver and keep you from receiving the goodness that God has for you. Those 4 things are, you got to quit glorifying God, not putting the proper value on Him. You've got to quit being thankful, which includes memory and submission, recognizing that you aren't the source of everything, it's God. The third thing is you got to start using your imagination in a negative way instead of a positive way. And the fourth thing it lists in Romans 1:21 is that your foolish heart becomes darkened. So this week I've been talking about the third thing, about this imagination and the way you see things on the inside. And again, I haven't got time to go back through all of that, but it says right here in Hebrews chapter 11, and verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. You know, that's a verse that most people probably don't have underlined in their Bible, but this is really significant. It says the first thing that they had to do was to see these promises afar off. What does that mean? Again, I've been saying these things all this week, but there is a difference between just having information and then seeing those things come to pass. You know, I've used this example a lot. I've used it on my television program many times, and so some of you might have heard this before. But there's a lot of people that this will be the first time they've ever heard this, and it's just one of the best illustrations that I've ever heard about this. And there was a pastor's wife that had really poor eyesight. She was legally blind. She had to wear these glasses that were really thick. And she had had many people pray for her, and she was trying to believe God for healing, but she'd just been prayed for so many times, she didn't want to be disappointed again. So there was a healing evangelist that was coming to the church, and she avoided him, not wanting him to pray for her. And finally, the last night of the meeting, he just cornered her, and he said, I want to pray for you. So he made her take her glasses off, and then he laid hands on her and prayed for her, And he says, now can you see? So she started to open her eyes. And when she started to open her eyes, he said, shut your eyes. And she was confused, like, how can I tell if I can see if I don't open my eyes? So the second time he says, now can you see? So she started to open her eyes, and he says, shut your eyes. And she shut her eyes. And the third time he says, now can you see? And she started to open her eyes, and he says, I'm not telling you to open your eyes. You've got to see yourself seeing on the inside before you'll see it on the outside. And she finally understood what he was saying. And this is what I've been trying to say, is that with your imagination, you've got to see yourself well. And so she kept her eyes closed. She prayed in tongues for a while, and finally she said, I can see. I see myself seeing without my glasses. And he says, now open your eyes. And she opened her eyes, and her eyesight had been restored. But see, how many times do people pray for something and they're asking for it, but they've never seen it on the inside? They're asking God to set them free from this pain, from the dependence upon medication or whatever it is, and they're asking God for healing, but they see themselves sick. They've never seen themselves any other way. This is especially true of people that were raised in a situation where from a child they were told that they couldn't eat certain foods, that they had this problem or something, and they've grown up with it, and it's just become a part of their identity. They see themselves sick, and yet they're praying for healing. You have to see it on the inside before you see it on the outside. Here's an example of this over in Genesis chapter 15. The Lord told Abraham, he said in verse 1, he said, after these things the word of the Lord came unto Abram in a vision, saying, fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what shalt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the servant of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? Now you've got to remember that God had promised him that he was going to have a child, and that through this child all of the nations of the world would be blessed. And God had given him this promise that he was going to have multitudes of children. And yet at this time he didn't have one, and he revealed what he was seeing on the inside. He says, what are you going to do for me? Because this Eliezer, one of his slaves, his servant who was over all of the other servants, he says, this is my heir. This is what he was seeing. And look at this. It says, and Abram said, behold, to me thou hast given no seed, and lo, one born in my house is mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth out of thy bowels shall be thine heir. And in verse 5 it says, and he brought him forth abroad, and said, look now towards the heaven, and tell the stars, if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. Now get a picture of this. This is really significant. The Lord had promised Abram that he was going to have a child, and yet he was old. His wife was past childbearing age. And so he was saying, God, how's this going to be? Because this Eliezer is my heir. God says, no, that's not going to be it. And he brought him outside of the tent and told him to look up at the stars. Now this is really significant. In a sense, every one of us are born under a tent. That there is a limit, a ceiling on what we can see and what we can do. The Lord didn't just tell Abraham, I'm going to make your children as numerous as the stars. He brought him outside of that tent so that he could look up and see this. He had to see his children being as numerous as the stars in the sky. He had to see it on the inside before it could happen and come to pass on the outside. Every one of us have these ceilings over us that, sometimes it's our family, sometimes it could be a teacher, some negative experience, it could be a marriage that didn't work out, you went through a divorce, that your children rejected you, or if you're a child that your parents have rejected you. But there's things that happen that try and paint a picture on the inside of us of what we're capable of. And the sad fact is, most people put a limit on that. man, this is really, I just wish somehow or another I could just download the things that God has shown me. This is what I'm trying to teach, but this is so far removed from most people that they just struggle to receive it. You know, I never was the best at anything. I never was the worst at anything. I was just average, and I had a picture on the inside of me like that. And God had to change that and start showing me that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I had to change that image. You know, my dad died when I was just 12 years old. And I remember my brother, who was 4.5 years older than me, he came to me not long after that, and he said, our dad is dead, but I'm gonna try and be your dad. And I'm sure that my brother meant good by that, but boy, that just offended me. And I thought, man, there's no way that you're ever gonna substitute for my dad. And even though I've always loved my brother and I've looked up and respected him, I just went out of my way to keep from doing all the stuff he was teaching me. And one of the things, my brother was just a natural born mechanic. I mean, he could just fix anything mechanical, and he worked on cars. He had a 56 Ford Fairlane that he took the engine apart and put it back together just to see if he could do it. And so he had a lot of expertise in that area. Well, I went the other direction, just kind of, I guess it was rebellion or whatever. And so because of it, I am not mechanical at all. And I remember after I had this experience with the Lord and I began to start trying to take the limits off God and see myself do things, we rented a little house, and it just had this serving dish that was carved out of wood, and it had, grapes, a grapevine on it, and it was a beautiful little serving dish. But when you picked it up, it was supposed to play a tune, and it wouldn't work. And you know what? In the past, I just had avoided things like that, but I was saying I can do all things. And I remember just praying over that. I took the thing apart and cleaned it up and put it back together, and it started working. And I still have that thing with me today in my office. And every time I pick that up, it's a reminder that, you know what, I just started removing that ceiling. I thought I could never do stuff like that. I started working on cars. I fixed a washing machine that was given to us that wouldn't work. And those are small things. And some people might think, well, that's not a very, good illustration. But if I hadn't have been able to accomplish those small things, I wouldn't be able to do the big things that I'm doing today. I had to start taking steps to change that image that was on the inside of me. I had to come out from under the tent and look up to the heavens and see the promise that God had given me. And if I couldn't have seen it on the inside, I wouldn't be seeing it on the outside today. And brothers and sisters, I'm telling you, there's people watching this that God has never made a dud. God has never made anybody just to be a placeholder. God has a supernatural, specific plan for your life. It's awesome. It says in Jeremiah 29:11, I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. The NIV says a hope and a future. God's plans for you are good. They're good plans. God never created anybody to be a failure. God never created anybody to just be average. Now, I'm not saying that everybody is supposed to do something spectacular in the eyes of the world, but your life should be supernatural. If it's not supernatural, it's superficial. That doesn't mean that everybody's supposed to be on television, everybody's supposed to be a government official, everybody's supposed to be world-renowned, but everybody's life should be supernatural. There ought to be no way to explain away your life except that, man, God is the one who's blessed me. God is the one who's caused these things to happen. I had a group of housewives in the group that I pastored in Lamar, Colorado. And those housewives, there was these 7 sisters that their mother died. And they all called each other and went over there and prayed for their mother and saw her raised from the dead. And that afternoon, after she was raised from the dead, she got up and walked 2 miles into town and bought groceries and came back. One of those sisters also had her daughter pull over an 1100cc motorcycle and it landed on her when she was just 1 year old and just smushed her flat. And the woman got her and put her body back, put it into the shape it was supposed to, and prayed over her, and she rose from the dead. Now, see, those are housewives. They aren't on television and things like that, but God, it was supernatural what they were doing. It takes, I tell you, raising children is harder than raising the dead. Amen. I had to do both to my kids, and I tell you what, raising my youngest son from the dead was a piece of cake compared to raising him, and growing him up. It takes the supernatural power of God. So you ought to be seeing the supernatural power of God in your life. But do you see yourself that way? Or do you see yourself just an average person? Do you see yourself a failure? Are you one of these that just says, man, if I do something, it's going to fail? You just have the opposite of the Midas touch. Everything you touch turns to dirt. There's people that see themselves that way. And what you don't recognize is that is your imagination. That's the way that you see yourself, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can't see yourself doing something, you won't. You have to see yourself succeeding. There's some of you that are praying for healing, but you've never seen yourself healed. You need to get to where you spend time just meditating and letting your imagination see, what would it be like if I was well? One of the things that I did as we've been building these buildings, the Lord told me from Psalm 78:41 that I had limited Him by my small thinking. And so I just said, I'm not going to think small anymore. I'm not going to think like I've got a limited resource. That God is my source, and God is 𝗁𝘍𝑆haddai, not 𝗁𝘍𝗶𝘆. And so when we started building buildings, one of the things I did, I just started building what I wanted. If you were to ever come to our place and see our facilities, like this building that I call the barn, it's got these rafters in it that are 90,000 pounds. Each one of these 7 rafters are 90,000 pounds. They're some of the largest wooden rafters in the United States. It's beautiful. I could have built that building cheaper, but that's just what I wanted, and I was going to take the limits off of God. We put in terrazzo floors, which aren't the cheapest floors, but they're one of the best floors, and I just loved it. I saw it in an airport and thought, I'd like that. We've got a waterfall that I saw when I was in Mexico, and I thought, man, that would be beautiful. I'd love to have something like that. And I just did what I wanted to do. Now, it wasn't just carnal things, but I would pray about it, and I believe that God wanted me to do it. He wanted me to build these things. And so, did you know, we spent a year and a half with architects. I had already spent $1.5 million on the architectural fees designing these things before I ever asked them, what is this going to cost? I never did things thinking about what's it going to cost. I just decided that I don't have any money. God's going to have to do it. And you know what? We built all of those buildings in 9.5 years, debt-free. We now have like $160 or $70 million worth of assets debt-free. And when people come here, it's quality. It's nice looking. It's not cheap. But see, there's a lot of people that the first thing they think of, if the Lord was to tell them to build something, they would think, how cheap can I do it? I've got a limited amount of resources. Well, that's you looking to yourself instead of looking to God. If God was truly your source, you wouldn't do things so cheaply. And I have people all of the time that come to our ministry, and it's not opulent. We didn't waste money. We saved money where we could. We didn't just throw money away, but we did not build things cheaply. We built things to last. And I have people come here all of the time that see our facility, and before they ever sit under the Word, and before they ever get prayer or anything like that, they're already challenged because they're seeing that we just are doing things with excellence. We're doing it with quality. We aren't doing things as cheaply as they can do. There's a lot of Christians that honestly have a bad rap. There's Christians that'll go out and say, I'm a minister, could you give me a discount? I tell you, that infuriates me. That's saying that because we're Christians, we just can't pay full price for anything. Could you please give us a discount? I think that's a terrible testimony. Man, God, if anybody should be able to pay full price, it ought to be a believer. Now, if you get a discount, I'm not against that. People give me discounts, I'll take them. But I'm saying that this whole attitude about that somehow or another, if we're Christians, we just can't do things with this much quality, that is a terrible, terrible attitude. And you know what that is? That's your imagination. You see yourself as, well, here we are down here. We aren't up there like where the world are. We can't do things with the same excellence and the same quality that the world does. That is a sorry attitude. And that reveals that you have an image problem. You see yourself somehow or another as a second-rate person, not able to do the things that other people are able to do. Man, that's limiting God. That's what the Lord spoke to me. He says, you're limiting me by your small thinking. And because I changed my thinking, long before I ever was able to send out a letter to my partners and tell people about what God had spoken, I mean just immediately, finances began to start increasing. Everything began to change. I had a person that we were really needing somebody to help us run the ministry because we were growing and it just was beyond Jamie and my ability to do it. And I had been praying for 2 years for somebody to come help me. And within a couple of days of me making a decision that, all right, I'm going to start dreaming big and thinking big. Within 2 days, I had a man call me who had run, entire multiple units of Sears, and he actually was one of the speakers in Sears University where they trained everybody. And he just quit his job and says, I'm coming and going to work for you. And did you know what? I had to pay him more than what I was making. But he was well worth it, and I just decided I'd do it. And it changed everything. Everything began to change when I started seeing it differently on the inside. As you think in your heart, that's the way things will be on the outside if you really mix faith with that and stand against the attacks of the devil trying to steal your vision from you. But in just a brief period of time, if you see it on the inside, you will start seeing things on the outside. Hello, this is Andrew Wommack, and if you've enjoyed our program there on YouTube, I encourage you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share this with other people because, man, these truths will set people free. So check it out, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.